Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Minimalist podcast, where we discuss what it means to live a meaningful life with less. My name is Joshua Fields Milburn.
And I'm Ryan Nicodemus, and together, we're the Minimalists.
We got Malabama here.
Hi, everybody.
TK Coleman.
Have a holly jolly Christmas.
It's April!
What's wrong with Christmas in April?
Christmas every day in my heart.
Oh, man. We got the rest of our team here in the studio as well. And coming up today on this free public minimal episode, we're talking about a rather contentious subject: monogamy and non-monogamy, a subject about which your three hosts have three different viewpoints. And to clarify things, we're adding a fourth perspective from an expert. Joining us in the studio today is Aubrey Marcus. Aubrey is an author, podcaster, entrepreneur, filmmaker, philosopher, poet, and husband. If you find value in this conversation, you can check out the full 3-hour maximal edition of episode 385 with Aubrey Marcus, where we answer 5 times the questions and we dive deep into several simple living segments. That private podcast episode is out right now at patreon.com/theminimalists. Your support keeps our podcast and both of our YouTube channels 100% advertisement free, because advertisements suck. We'll start with our callers here in a moment. So if you have a question or a comment for our show, give us a call, 406-219-7839, or email a voice recording to podcast@theminimalists.com. But first, we have a question from Ivaros on Facebook.
Oh dear, a conversation about monogamy and open relationships. Is that even legal? I thought such explosive stuff was for confessional only. I find this topic very surprising in the context of minimalism. Why choose a personal trainer to dissect the pros and cons of promiscuity?
Wow. I didn't even know I was a personal trainer. So thank you. Thank you for that accolade that I didn't deserve. However, I appreciate it.
It's just that he's like really handsome and fit, and he's been on the cover of Men's Health magazine.
Yeah,
and so
I trained myself personally, I suppose. So there we go.
That's kind of like saying, why are you having a model talk about this?
Hey, look at you guys. It's hard to get a love fest over here.
So Aubrey, I found that judgment is the fastest way to shut down a conversation. So we put out a call for our listeners to send in questions about this. And this one was fascinating to me because there are some assumptions here. Of course, when you talk about Aubrey Marcus, you could say entrepreneur, you can say husband, you can say a podcaster, author, whatever. And someone says, well, here's a really fit guy, so I'm going to call him a personal trainer. But then I'm also going to say, to talk about the pros and cons of promiscuity. And that's a word with a lot of baggage associated with it as well. And I'm going to let Aubrey talk here because I'm really fascinated in his perspective. But the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast today to talk about this is you've gone through quite the transformation journey yourself. Someone who seemed to be really into polyamory and being having multiple partners, and then have found yourself in a monogamous relationship. And I don't even know what your current status is. And I thought maybe you could walk us through that journey and having a deeper understanding of what it means to be in relationship with someone else.
I mean, this is a huge question. Relationship is a central core part of our life. Like that dyad that we have, typically it's a dyad. Now there's some other different constellations that do exist, but typically it's a dyad between two people. That forms like the core nucleus that we build our lives around to a great degree. And sometimes we don't have that and we're single, and there's many different ways to do it, but that dyad is a core tenet of our life. So how to organize the structure around that is something that's very important. And I think we've been given this default model, which is you got to be monogamous and it's got to be this way and this is what you got to do. It's like basically downloading the contract from LegalZoom when you start your company and saying, oh yeah, it's perfect just as it is. No modifications necessary, right? And that's the way that we really have been kind of told in the mainstream about what we're supposed to do. And sometimes that works. Sometimes the LegalZoom contract works just right, and it's just exactly as you want. But I think we're all unique individuals with unique desires, and we're facing some different trends that are happening in the aggregate. So if you look at some of the trends that are happening in the aggregate, you can look at Dr. Wednesday Martin's book, Untrue. And in there, she charts graphs of sexual desire and the amount of times that people have sex with each other in marriage. And what you see is typically after 2 or 3 years, for the men, that starts to decline. Their sexual desire towards their partner starts to decline slowly on a kind of ever descending graph. And for women, actually, it falls off a cliff. And the graph goes up and then it just drops. And this is why we get all of those memes about when a man wants to have sex with his wife. I hope I get lucky tonight. Maybe I'll get lucky tonight, right? Like we have this in the zeitgeist that somehow the woman doesn't want to make love to her husband. And actually in the aggregate, that pans out. So we're seeing that there's an issue. Now, either you can just say, this is just life. This is how it works. If you're in this thing, this is what you can expect. No worries. And you can normalize that. Or you can say, no, I'm not going to accept that. I want to adjust the agreement or layer in new technology that I can use in my lovemaking that will actually change that dynamic. So those were the two choices. Now, the first choice I made was to adjust the agreement. And I adjusted the agreement by entering into a polyamorous container with my partner, Whitney. That was unbelievably difficult. I cannot express to you how difficult that was. And of course, you can lob your insults and accusations, and I promise you, it has a lot more to do with it than promiscuity. This is the pain and torture of knowing that your sweetheart, the one that you love, is just as free to go out and be with another man as you are free to be with another woman. And we both had several lovers during that period. But it was incredibly challenging. So it was really a path of evolution and self-transformation. But what we were doing is in the access to other partners, the novelty, right, of like being with somebody new sparked what the technical term is limerence, which is that new relationship energy where everything feels fresh and exciting. Because what you're doing is you're encountering the stranger in a new person. So for me, it was another face of the goddess. It was another woman that I could actually see and learn about and understand and see how she saw me and see my reflection in her and give her a reflection through me. And that process was beautiful. And my paramours, as they're called, they lasted, one was like 6 years or 3 years or 4 years. These were deep relationships that coincided with my primary partnership with Whitney, who was actually my fiance. But through that, it was incredibly challenging because at certain points, that limerence, that new relationship energy, it will actually make it feel like you're no longer the primary partner because they're so excited about she was so excited about her new boyfriend, or I was so excited about my new girlfriend that you were like, yeah, you're my queen and you're my king and we're in primary partnership. But really secretly, we're just thinking about these other people because that's the new relationship. That's the limerence energy. So it worked to keep passion alive, but it was ultimately incredibly difficult. And after 8 years of that journey in polyamory, it got the better of me. I just had to actually wave the white flag and say, like, I can't do this. So Whitney and I ended up splitting up. And then I was basically single for a period of time, even though Whitney and I would still, we're still entangled and we'd still see each other. But it got the better of me. I ultimately couldn't handle her being in love with other men. And I did my best and I got better at it for sure. From the first time she had a lover to the last time she had a lover, I was definitely more seasoned, more equipped. But it got the better of me. I was never able to actually fully, honestly be okay. And so there was lots of positive things on the other side. I had amazing, great relationships. And I was actually able to meet my wife. And we didn't start a relationship, but I was able to have the freedom to meet my wife and hang out with her because we were in a polyamorous container. Now, it took many years after meeting her before we actually got together. But when I got together with Vailana, then I was finished with polyamory and I was like, you're the one. We got married in a matter of months. And I was absolutely sure. I was like, I want to be with you the rest of my life. And I trusted that during that period, I'd also learned new technology. And the new technology was, how do you encounter the stranger in the same person over and over? How do you find novelty at depth rather than novelty in variety and breadth? So finding the stranger inside of her every single time, maybe not, this is exaggeration, but, as many times as we apply this technology, this tantric technology, finding the stranger in my same wife And that evokes that same level of passion. So all those graphs that I talked about in Dr. Wednesday Martin's book, those are going to be the things untrue, not the title of her book, because we're going to be the outlier. And that's the life that I'm living now, 3 years in.
Wow.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And what does that have to do with minimalism? If it's not already clear, I'll let you know. Minimalism is not about luxury goods and moving boxes and other things that we stuff away in a storage facility. It's about dealing with the things that weigh us down and hold us back from living the healthiest kind of life we can live. And so if you've got relationship clutter or psychological clutter, philosophical clutter, you can have a house empty of things and still be weighed down. And everything that Aubrey's talking about right now is about relationship clutter. The stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about how we relate to one another, and the process that he went through to downsize some things that was hurting him and making the quality of his life worse.
But TK, just to piggyback on that, the reason I wanted to have Aubrey here is I knew he would be talking about this without a particular dogma. I could talk to someone who is in a monogamous relationship and they say, well, actually, the right relationship is between one man and one woman. And even when you look at monogamy, we could talk about what monogamy is, like true monogamy. And the truest sense of the word is two people meet when they both are virgins and they spend their entire life together, right? And so most people who are advocating for monogamy aren't even advocating for that kind of monogamy. It's more about serial monogamy or being with one person at a time with no overlap. And so when we're talking about this subject, I want to talk to you because you obviously have some experience here on both sides. And you talked about the pain and the torture of being in an open relationship. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Well, yes. I mean, it was both pain and torture and absolute ecstasy, right? I mean, it was both of those. And you can't really talk about one without the other. There's the elation of being with those new partners. And there's the elation of actually what they call reclamation energy, when your partner's been with somebody else and you come back together and you try, and it's like you're trying to, fuse your energy field so deeply that all memory of past lovers goes away, right? It's like you try to smash together and it's like push out any memory of anybody that they've been with. So there's a lot of passion there. But fundamentally, there's a lot of reinforced, perhaps biologically, definitely sociological jealousy that's there. If your partner loves somebody else, if your partner wants to sleep with somebody else, there's some internal deficiency with you. Remember, the first lover my partner had was a professional fighter. And it was really brutal because I thought like, okay, if she's going to love me, I got to become a better fighter. So I got in the gym and I was like training hard. And then one day I was like, you're a fucking idiot. You're never going to be anywhere as good as this guy. He will beat you up 1,000 times out of 1,000. So what are you even doing? And it was like, I had to ultimately, this was one of the lessons. I had to trust that Whitney loved Aubrey for Aubrey. And the only thing I could do was be the most Aubrey that I could possibly be. So it was a lesson in self-love. But through the process, I felt deficient. I felt less than. I felt like I was not good enough. And it didn't matter what guy she was with, even if it was a guy that partied more than me and was free, more available for that type of expression of energy. I'd be like, I just work too hard. I'm a loser. I'm always working. I don't have the time to party with my sweetheart and be with her like he does. And of course she loves him more than me. He just didn't have a fucking job. You know what I mean? He was a good guy, but fundamentally I would try to compete with everything. I have to relearn that lesson over and over. And then they would have an experience that was really intense, either sexually or romantically. And then I'd be like, have we had an experience like that? Like, when was the last time that happened with us? What? It was so brutal. So brutal.
Torture, yeah.
Did you ever find yourself like trying to one up each other? Because it sounds like every time she... Okay, yeah.
I mean, that's a really toxic expression of how to handle it. And we did our best not to do that. But, I imagine that there was some of that in there, right?
Sure.
And certainly if one of us was with somebody else, the other one would make sure that they would be with one of their partners too, right? We tried, it was very difficult to just be sitting at home twiddling our thumbs being like, hope they're having a good time tonight. I really hope it's going well. Yeah. And sometimes we would be really gracious and they would be at a hotel and I'd call in and I'd order champagne for them as an honor of look, I honor that you're going to enjoy yourself. And she would do the same for me. And we would try our best, but it wasn't always fully available to us. And in some ways, Whitney did a better job than me in some regards as far as being able to deal with it. I'm just a more emotional creature, and it was really tough.
And so you struggled in this relationship. You also experienced great pleasure and ecstasy and joy and a lot of growth, it sounds like, as well. And yet, it seems to me that other people in a similar scenario don't have those same struggles. And so maybe you could talk about, from your exposure to people who are in open relationships that seem to be thriving, maybe they don't have that same level of jealousy or of discontent in the relationship. In fact, it could, for some people, be mostly upside. Is that right?
Yes, I don't see that often, to be honest. Because I don't think that the cultural structure is there to really support it. So what's difficult is that when you expose this idea to your friend group, there's going to be people with the conventional model and the conventional idea that will ask questions and be suspicious and kind of implant ideas that kind of undermines the structure. I actually do think that the structure can work, and it does work for some people. For sure. You're absolutely right about that. It's difficult though, because culturally it's not fully supported and the consciousness is not at a level where we're able to actually handle it. So those who are making it work are genuinely evolutionary pioneers, and they really have cultivated a strong community. And so just the utmost respect for anybody who's really making that work, because it is a challenging path, but it's an unbelievable path of growth. Unbelievable. So I still can recommend this path if you want to learn about yourself and you want to deal and grapple with these emotional forces, your own possessiveness, your own jealousy, your own self-love. You walk this path, you'll be a better person for having been broken time and time again and having to put yourself back together. Yeah. So that's what I really think about it. I think about it as a path for growth. And for some people, potentially, they can make it a sustainable path. I just haven't seen it that often work in that way.
Yeah. It's funny because I think about if someone wants to go down this path, you really got to question your intentions. Why do you want to go down this path? Because for me, when I hear about polyamory, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I would love to have different partners. But that is the high testosterone in me, speaking to my body. So I don't think I would be successful in it, honestly. And I'm also surprised that I can have this conversation right now. Because 10 years ago, maybe not 10 years, 15 years ago, I was really hardcore Jehovah's Witness Christian. And I would have not have even entertained this conversation. But I'm glad we're having it.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I found when we put out a call for questions about this, a lot of people have that knee-jerk reaction because they assume it's this weird sort of binary. It's either monogamy or it is chaos. And there's chaos in either one of these, by the way.
Totally.
And there can be order. In fact, there are some terms we're going to be talking about today when we get to some of our callers here, which we'll get to in a second, because monogamy and non-monogamy, there's a whole, as we were doing photos downstairs, you're like, there's a whole world in between there. And so I thought maybe we would address a bit of that. Let's move on to some of our callers here. Professor Sean, we have an anonymous caller.
In the non-monogamy world, there's a pretty large acceptance of the term compersion. Loosely, it's explained as feeling pleasure from someone else's pleasure, even if you're not directly benefiting, and applied even more genuinely among the group that identifies ethical non-monogamous. Although this is quite a juxtaposition concept for people who believe that the terms ethical and non-monogamy can't be placed together. My question is for someone who experiences compersion to a fault, being that they continue to prioritize other people's pleasure over themselves to the point of feeling that it's more difficult to accept care from others than give care, even if it's not hurting them or sacrificing their own well-being, but it does isolate them and also hurt the people who want to give care. How can that person create a healthier relationship with their own needs or wants that directly benefit themselves and begin to heal the belief that no one will care or take care of them really consistently. And due to that pain, the answer was to care for others unconditionally and never let that be the case for people they care about because they themselves had never experienced it. And to a fault, continue the cycle of fear and rejection by not allowing good people to prove the belief wrong. In times when this person has tried to be vulnerable, they find the reality that people are imperfect and that is good and okay, but still feels unsafe, acknowledging that this is largely due to confirmation bias. Also, for context, some people with deductive reasoning would wonder if this person has a past of abuse, and that would be correct. But in traditional CBT therapy, the concept of non-monogamy is not widely accepted, making this topic difficult to seek perspective on. For this person personally, through their experiences and overcoming their past and reaching for healing and love, they found hope and acceptance among people who do not shame complex sexuality that comes from broken pasts. They have learned to accept that overcoming trauma does change a person, and the paths to healing and self-acceptance do not always look conventional.
I think the key word here is complex.
Yeah.
Let's get some terms out onto the table here. She talked briefly about compersion, and that's something that comes up a lot in non-monogamous relationships. It's almost like an introductory word for people.
Right.
I've always used it to describe my relationship with my daughter because, like, whenever she experiences joy, it feels contagious. It's like real joy, and I notice that in people around me. So you can talk about compersion in a non-sexual or intimate way, but it tends to be used in these ethically non-monogamous relationships, which that term by itself also drives me a little bit crazy because there's plenty of ethical monogamous relationships, but plenty of non or unethical monogamous relationships as well. Having to use that term that way presupposes that monogamy is inherently ethical and therefore non-monogamous relationships are inherently unethical. But that doesn't seem to be the case. The bigger problem that our anonymous caller is talking about here is some of the fear and the rejection, which you've expressed a bit as well. What insights do you have for her?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think talking about ethical non-monogamy, there was never a more ethical relationship up to date than my polyamorous relationship because the honesty was at exactly 100. There was not a single thing that we had to hide from each other or would hide. So another term for that is kitchen table polyamory, where everything is out in the open. All of the partners are able to talk to each other. There's no secrets. There's nothing hidden. It's radical 100% truth and 100% permission. And that is actually rare in most monogamous relationships that I've encountered. Even if actions aren't taken, thoughts cannot be shared because the thoughts are too volatile and chaotic and dangerous to share. If you find somebody attractive, if you feel yourself feeling something, well, you can't share that. That's not part of the agreement. So you stuff that in and you keep that little bit secret from your partner. So I found that this style of relationship with the radical permission allows you to have an even higher standard of ethics because there's nothing that you can't share, nothing you can't talk about. And I've replicated that in my now monogamous relationship with my wife because that was a prerequisite. I wanted there to be radical communication and conversation. If either of us were attracted to anybody, we don't have to do anything about it, but we got to share it. There's nothing that I want her to feel like she needs to keep secret from me, and there's nothing that I want to keep secret from her. So that standard of honesty was another thing that polyamory taught me. So then going to compersion. Compersion was always the goal. I wanted to feel the ecstasy that my partner felt when she was in sexual relation with another person. I just couldn't do it. Right. And I think a lot of people would make accusations of me. Oh, Aubrey, Cuck Norris, the beta cuck, who's enjoying. Cuckolding is a fantasy where you actually enjoy the idea of another man sleeping with your partner. I don't have that kink. It's just not in me at all.
Yeah,
so
some people would compliment you for not having that.
Right. Yeah, it's like that. I mean, and praise be to those who have it because that makes things a lot easier, I'm sure, right? Because it's like they're being aroused by their partner's arousal with another person. For me, I didn't have that. So it was a matter of love and consciousness. And I could touch it at certain points, but it was very difficult for me to maintain it. And so compersion, again, we're all familiar with compassion. The etymology of compassion is to be with someone in their suffering. Compersion the etymology is to be with somebody in their pleasure, right? To really be with somebody in their pleasure. And to do that is to actually not be looking at them separately. It's to be on the inside of their pleasure. And so, yes, this can happen sexually in a sexual situation for sexual pleasure, but it happens all the time. Like, I think you can tell a good friend of yours, if a good friend experiences something amazing, then you feel all of the pleasure and joy, and potentially even more pleasure and joy than that person feels. I remember it with good friends of mine that were fighters. You know, one of my best friends in the world is Aaron Rodgers, a football player. I remember when he beat the Cowboys last year and I was there at the game. Like, the feeling that I felt was like probably more elated than he even felt in that moment. And that's compersion. It's like really being with somebody in that sensation. The caller mentioned some things that were, you know, kind of conflating this type of relating to a trauma pattern or things like that. I think that's an oversimplification. And while that may be the case, sometimes this is just a choice and a solution for somebody who is dealing with this idea. Like, I don't want to live in a sexually passionless life. I don't have the tantric technology to find the stranger anew in my partner. So I'm going to engage in this practice because I want to be honest. I'm not willing to be unfaithful. So I'm going to engage in this out of my own volition. And that was my path. I've had a beautiful relationship with my mother and pretty much every woman on down the line. I had a pretty sketchy girlfriend in college one time. But other than that, it's been like epic, right? So this is not a wounding thing with the feminine. And it's not about me like wanting to claim trophies. I don't give a shit about that. Like, every person I wanted to be with, I wanted to go as deep as I could until I could see the inner core of who they were and share that relation. So the idea that this is some kind of trauma bonding or trauma-driven thing, to me, that's just false. It's just not true. And I'm the outlier. I mean, I'm the exception to that idea. And I don't know if that's exactly what she was saying, but it seemed to have that kind of implication.
Well, there's also something about empathy that's in this question. And I think empathy is a bit of a bell curve. There's suffering on both ends. If you have no empathy at all for anyone ever, that can either cause suffering, or it could be that there's some sort of trauma associated with that. You've shut off all empathy. But the other side of the bell curve is if you're feeling all the empathy, you're feeling the pain. So the etymology of empathy means to also feel their suffering, right? And so to feel the suffering, not just be with them with suffering, but to feel that suffering is true empathy. If you have intense, really turned up empathy, well, what happens? You are also going to suffer. By definition, you have to suffer. And so I think maybe part of that was, and I'm speaking for you at this point, but in your relationship, there was suffering there that the two of you were sharing when you were in a polyamorous relationship. And so the suffering can become contagious.
Yeah, it can. And it's, you have to, and I think she was also a bit concerned about somebody overgiving of themselves to give somebody pleasure and then not feeling the pleasure themselves. It's not compersion if you're not with them in their pleasure. So the whole concept that you're going to give somebody pleasure but not feel it, that's not compersion. That's self-sacrifice. That's a whole different thing, right? Like, it's a much different thing. If you're actually in compersion, you're both elevating your state of pleasure. You know, it's not like you're giving them this and it's costing you something. No, you're sharing in this state of emotional activation and aliveness.
Yeah. I think empathy is one hell of a drug. And when it becomes a drug, it can really turn on you. I mean, when you experience someone else's pain, you're doing them a service, and they will show you like, oh, thanks for being with me in my pain. And that feels good. So it's easy to get caught up in doing things for others. Because that's what I kind of heard from the caller, was that someone gets caught up in empathy and they really don't focus on their own pain or joy because they're so caught up in reflecting someone else's pain. So, I mean, empathy, like, we put on this pedestal, and I think that empathy is a great thing to have. We all need it. But when it becomes a drug, like, it can really hold us back, especially with the situation she's talking about people who are abused and have these wounds that are trying to heal, because you come from that background where you've been abused, like, you're used to feeling bad about yourself. And that's like, in a weird way, it's security. It's like, if you do a certain thing, you're going to feel bad about yourself, and you'd rather, have the devil than the devil you don't know.
Yeah. And you take away that compersion, it introduces so many unhealthy elements in the relationship. Like if I'm making sacrifices for you and I see myself as I'm doing you a favor, right?
You're keeping score.
There you go.
Yeah.
I have that martyrdom syndrome and then I resent you. Can compersion be cultivated?
Yes, it can. It can. And it's a technology again. And I keep using the word technology because these are psychotechnologies. I think we try to reduce our technology to like, what's the new Apple update on the phone? That's one type of technology in the material realm. But psychotechnologies have been being cultivated by many cultures for thousands of years, from the Hebrew Kabbalist lineage, which I've entered as a part of, to the Mahayana Buddhist lineage, to the Taoist lineages, to all of the tantric lineages, to so many more lineages that have cultivated psychotechnologies, either for meditative practices going inside to emotional practices of how you actually enter a state where you can join someone in their emotional frequency. Right? These are technologies that can be cultivated. And part of it is to be able to clear yourself of any jealousies, clear yourself of any judgments, clear yourself of anything that's withholding you. And then with volition, with intention, enter into their emotional state of rapture, joy, ecstasy. And to do that, you have to really eliminate all of the comparison and all of the jealousy, anything like that you're feeling, and then be willing to surrender any aspect of your own ego identity and just jump in with them, jump into the waters of where they're at and meet them there. And it's a skill that can be cultivated.
Yeah. As we wrap up this question, I was hoping maybe you could talk a bit about the tantric technology that you're experiencing in your own marriage now and how you understand that and how you use it regularly.
Yeah. So I'm currently working on a project with a teacher, Dr. Rabbi Mark Gaffney, and it's called The Phenomenology of Eros. And the phenomenology of Eros goes through 7 different levels of sexual relating. And in those 7 different levels, there's different technologies that you can use to actually encounter somebody in a new and deeper way and actually use your sexuality to reach parts of you that are different. Everything from healing sexing, where the idea isn't just the vital sexing, which is level 1, just like the animality of the experience and just that thing that you see in all of the movies where someone pins someone up against the wall and they're making out and then it's onto the kitchen table and things are crashing around. Like, that's great, and that's one way to do it, but it's not going to be all the time. So like healing sexing is actually going in and going real slow, feeling where there's any places where there's any trauma that's still left in the body and applying the right amount of love, the right amount of questions, asking what do you need right now? What is this like? What does this touch feel like? And of course, some of it is intuitive and you're really working together for that. Other parts involve, what we call personality sexing, which includes sexual theater, which is all of the dominant and submissive play. So you're playing out different roles, for example. And in those different roles, you get to encounter an element of your partner that isn't normally available there. Like one of the old technologies of wearing a mask, whether it was Commedia dell'arte or whether it was something else, is the mask allows you to embody some aspect that you normally wouldn't embody.
The new identity.
It's a new identity. So you take on a new identity, and through that new identity, a part of you gets to flourish and flower, and then you get to relate to a part of them through your different identity. So it's really 2 strangers meeting. You have different names, you have different roles, you have different polarities than your normal polarity. And that's incredibly rich, portal to go in. And there's other different portals that you can actually enter into with intention that illuminate different aspects of your partner.
Welcome back to the Minimalists. Ryan, what time is it?
You know what time it is. It's time for the lightning round where we answer your questions from TikTok.
You can follow the Minimalists on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at the Minimalists. During the lightning round, we each have 60 seconds to answer your question with a short, shareable, less than 140 character response. We put the text to these minimal maxims in the show notes over at theminimalists.com/podcast. So you can copy and share our pithy answers on social media if you like. And we have a question today from Anonymous.
It's a lot to ask for one person to be your everything. Love is limitless. Why put a limit on how much of it you can give or receive?
Now, TK, I know when this question is asked, we often talk about love. I don't think we know what we're talking about when we talk about love most of the time. We use that word colloquially, and I get it. Quite often when we say love, what we're really saying is, I like it very much.
Yeah.
Oh, I love this new microphone.
Yeah.
No, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about love. When we talk about love, it's to see someone for who they are without trying to change them. And without trying to manipulate them, persuade them, convince them, drag them to my point of view. But quite often when we're talking about love, we're talking about our attachment to someone else, our clinging to someone else. And I would posit that clinging actually blocks love. It gets in the way. Now, Ryan, you had a bit of a different view on this question, or maybe a more nuanced view on this question. It seems like this person may be in an open relationship or a poly relationship, which
Potentially.
are potentially two different things here. Yeah. So what were your thoughts on the meaning of this question?
Well, it seems to me like they're trying to make an excuse to hoard love and to have an excess of love, which... I think when you have that attitude towards love, eventually, it is going to feel like hoarding. Especially when you take a measurement to it. Can I read my answer?
Yeah, you got something pithy? Put some 60 seconds on the clock, Prof.
So there is no measuring stick for love. To love someone is to see them, appreciate them, and accept them for who they are, warts and all. And as soon as you start to measure love, as soon as you start to keep track of what one person does for another, what they did for me, it's a losing game.
Yes.
You will start to harbor resentment, because eventually you're going to feel that it's off balance one way or the other. So to love someone, whether it's monogamy or non-monogamy, that love can be endless. It doesn't matter if it's one person or many people. I think there's a deep well when it comes to love, and we don't have to measure how deep that well is. I mean, to love someone really like in a monogamous relationship, it's kind of like there's this like third entity that you're serving. You're not serving the person. You're serving the relationship. And then when you can get on the same, what Aubrey was talking about, when you get on the same page on what your relationship's mission is, like that's a beautiful thing to serve. And you can't give it enough love. I think you can always give that relationship love. And some people like to do it in a non-monogamous way, and that's okay too.
Ooh. Right under a minute.
Hey.
So TK, let's expand on this, because Ryan and I have radically different views on this. And I think it's okay. I think it's actually helpful and maybe even insightful for the audience, because I don't see a separate relationship. I think there is no such thing as a relationship. Whether you are in a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous relationship, there isn't a separate thing. That is just a word that allows us, it's a signpost. When I'm driving down the 101 to get to Los Angeles, I see a sign that says, Los Angeles, 4,100,372, whatever, people. And that's fine. It's a signpost. But that sign itself is not actually Los Angeles. And if I were to mistake that sign for there's Los Angeles, because it says Los Angeles on the sign. And so when we're talking about a relationship, I don't see that there's some sort of third entity here. I see it as I arrive and this other person arrives. Ryan and I have a relationship only insofar as how we interact with one another. And it could be daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, whatever. I have relationships with people I talk to once a year. You know, I have a good friend back in Ohio. We'll talk once or twice a year. And there is some sort of, we are in relationship, but there's not a third entity for me the way that I see it. And he sees it differently. Yeah. And he sees it in a way that's helpful for him.
Exactly.
And that way isn't helpful for me.
Right. And you know, I think you're getting caught up in the definition of a relationship, which I know we hate getting caught up in definitions. But the word relationship for me is more of an ethereal thing. And really when Aubrey was talking about that wholeness level, like that's what I'm talking about. Because there isn't this like, I'm going to do something for you, you do something for me, we're in this together, we're with each other through thick and thin. It's like, what are we both serving together? And that's really what relationship means to me. And we use metaphors all the time to help us understand different things. And yes, the third entity might make sense for me and it may not make sense for you, and that's okay. I mean, it makes Josh wrong, but that's okay.
By the way, I love when people talk about definitions. I have never at any point in my life ever been irritated or inconvenienced when someone pressed me for a definition or felt the need to articulate their own. Because for me, definitions aren't dogmas. They're not commandments that we have to obey. All definitions, even the ones in the dictionary, are simply descriptions created by human beings of what some people have meant when they use a word. And when we communicate with one another, it's helpful to know what we're talking about. So if you tell me I mean this, even if that's not my definition, well, it's okay. Now I know what you mean by that word, and we won't waste any valuable time having disagreements over things that we actually have a shared understanding over. So I think talking about definitions is one of the most underrated, underdone things in conversation. Seriously.
What did it for me was when Bill Clinton was like, define the word the. Was it the?
No, is. It depends what the definition of is.
Yeah, what is the definition of is to you? I'm like, oh boy.
Let's give him 60 seconds. Otherwise, he'll talk all day. TK Coleman, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, man. Love does not create the limits. Love is that which creates through the limits. Love isn't about artificially imposing constraints on people in the name of romance, in the name of friendship, in the name of family. Love is about accepting, acknowledging, and appreciating and affirming the constraints that are already there, and then figuring out a way, how can I be authentically me? And how can I support you in your quest to be authentically you as we work together to co-create the most beautiful experience we can within the context of what we call relationship. That's what love's all about.
Yeah.
Give me 60 seconds, Prof. And maybe we'll unpack it together, the three of us. Clinging to love is like clinging to water. The harder you clench, the faster it disappears. We've all been in a relationship with someone where something is a bit off. Maybe they don't feel the same way they used to feel about me. Oh, what's wrong? Oh, TK, please tell me what's wrong. And then I cling tighter and tighter and tighter until what happens? I start to strangle you. I actually strangle the love out of the relationship. If I try to cling to water that's in my hand, I open my hand and none is left. If I cling to a relationship and I cling tighter and tighter and tighter, I open my hand to realize, oh, the love is gone because of my clenching, because of my clinging, because of my attachment. Those attachments aren't love. Attachment gets in the way of love. It blocks love. And the way that we can love someone is to cease clinging to them, because then you can actually see them for who they are. And that's what love is.
Man, what you just said is so important, because there are these different stages of a relationship. There's like that lust that you first have. And then Aubrey was talking about it. That starts to wane. People don't know what to do. And they cling to that lust because they don't know how to evolve their love with their partner. And and what you're saying is really encouraging people to not cling to the love they wish they had, and cling to what love actually is in the moment with whoever they're with.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a lot more about open relationships coming up on the private podcast. We're going to check in with the Patreon live stream in a moment as well. But first, real quick for right here, right now, here's one thing that's going on in the life of the minimalist. Did you know over on Patreon, we have 3 different minimalism series. We have 5 episodes of something called Relationship with Less. A couple years ago now, when we released our book, Love People Use Things, I did this 5-part series, and I just sort of walk through our relationship with less, these different relationships that we have in our lives. And so when people are always asking, what does this have to do with minimalism? What does this have to do with minimalism?
Yeah.
I will show you. And in fact, there's an entire 5-part series. TK was actually present for one of those as well. You can find all 5 of those over at patreon.com/The Minimalist. Also, 5 episodes of Minimalism Today. I turned myself into a therapist for 5 little episodes where I called up patrons on the phone and we just talked about whatever they were struggling with.
Yeah.
Hey, what are you struggling with right now? Some people was stuff, some people was relationships, some people was past trauma, whatever it was. Let's break that down together. And then also during the pandemic, we had 50 quarantine conversations, including one of my favorites with Dan Savage, my favorite sex advice columnist. He's a great podcaster, the Savage Love podcast, where he talks about monogamy and non-monogamy, relationships and sex advice. And we did a conversation with him over there. Patreon.com/theminimalist. You can find all 50 of those quarantine conversations, 5 episodes of minimalism today, 5 episodes of relationship with less, and of course our weekly maximal episodes over there. Speaking of Patreon, Alabama, let's check in with the Patreon live stream. What do you got for us?
We have a question here from Amber. How do you bring up the subject of wanting to expand into an open relationship with a partner you've been with for several years?
Let's start by identifying how not to talk about it.
Yeah.
Quite often, the things that are most fraught, the most stressful, the most worrisome, we will bring them up at the most inopportune times. We can all think about a time that we had in our lives where it's like, this thing's really stressed me out. It's weighing on my mind. I've got this mental clutter, but I'm going to wait 2 minutes before my wife's trying to run out the door. She's grabbing the purse. The daughter's over here. Hey, sweetheart, can I talk to you about opening the relationship real quick?
I just want to throw that out there. You think about it, and then we'll talk about it later.
While you're on your way to work.
Oh my goodness.
Now the opposite of that is also true quite often, because there's never the absolute perfect time to talk about these difficult conversations. What happens? We never talk about it. And so quite often what I do is I set a deadline for myself. Hey, I know this is a really important conversation that I want to have with my wife, with TK, with Ryan, whoever it might be, right? I want to have this difficult conversation. Now, we're in the middle of a podcast right now. It'll probably be a terrible time for me to have this conversation. I'm going to call up my wife. In fact, when we were recording earlier with Aubrey during the private podcast, I wrote something down that was revelatory for me. I mean, I'm not even ready to talk about it yet. And so if I'm not ready to talk about it, it's obviously not the most opportune time. But there will be a time that I need to talk about it. So I have some sort of deadline. I need to talk to my wife about this by the end of the month. And then what is the most opportune time within that time frame? That's what's important. There'll never be the perfect time, but I'll find the most ideal time to talk about this somewhere before that deadline.
That's right. And where you have the conversation is also as important as when you have the conversation. Because in the same way you point out, there's no perfect time to have it, but there are some horrible times to have it. There's no perfect place to have the conversation, but there are some horrible places to have it. You don't want to break this out at Starbucks. You want to be like, hey, I just want to spend some time together today and, go over a few things. And then you get in the middle of Starbucks and it's crowded and it's a bunch of people around and you're putting the pressure on them to have a reaction that is both honest and also respectful towards you in this public space. And I'm not saying that you're thinking about having it in Starbucks, but where you have the conversation is also important. The other thing I would say is I believe that it's helpful to give people the space to mentally prepare for a conversation of this nature, even if it creates a little tension leading into it. One way you can do that is you can write an email or a letter, and you can say, I'm putting it in writing because I want you to have the space to react. But this is something that I want to discuss a little bit more. And you can give them some context. If you don't want to document it, put it in writing, that's totally cool. Another thing is to say, without having too much time to wait, like, I really need to talk about some things that are really pressing on my heart. It's like super important to me that we can be able to sit down and discuss. Yeah. Now, that's going to make them nervous. That's going to, is everything okay? Is everything all right? But at least when you have this conversation, they know this is the thing that's been weighing on your mind. And they're like mentally ready to be very attentive and to listen and to discuss versus, just like, hey, we need to spend some more time together. And then you're walking around at Disneyland or you're sitting down at a restaurant and boom, they're not mentally prepared for it. Those would just be a couple of bits of perspective I throw into the pot.
Yeah. I mean, the question that I would ask this patron is, do you feel like you can just tell your partner this? Like, do you feel comfortable enough to just go to them and say this? And if not, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but that's the preface I would give. It's like, why don't you feel like you can go to your partner and talk to them about this? And so maybe start there before you send them an email. Hey, I want to talk about opening up our relationship, which there is a way to ease into it. There's a way that you could ease into this and open it right up to that conversation. However, there's a deeper problem right now in that relationship if she feels like there's no way her partner would want to talk about this and would just put up a wall instantly.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important to keep in mind here, from what you're both saying here, there's some best practices I use in my own life that I didn't even realize I necessarily use them. It's just part of my difficult conversation practice. And I have to have a bunch of difficult conversations. Ryan and I have been having difficult conversations for 32 years now.
Yeah.
And we had to have one recently, but I always sit down and write out. This is my process. I'm not prescribing it to anyone else. Bex and I had to have a really difficult conversation about a month ago. And I sat down and wrote pages and pages, not so I could communicate those pages to him, to Ryan or to Bex or whomever. And I was like, hey, here's my difficult conversation. Read it.
Actually, it was one page for me because he knows that's about all I can handle.
It was a tweet. A subtweet.
Right.
But no, what I'll do is I'll write it out so I better understand what I actually want to communicate. What am I struggling with? Where is the discontent? Where did it arise from? Where do we go from here? These are some important questions I have to ask myself. What does the ideal version of us look like going forward if this current version is no longer serving us? Maybe it served us for a period of time, but it's no longer serving us. I want to be really clear on what the new version of us looks like so we can have that conversation. The only way I can do that is if I sit down and I write pages and pages and cross stuff out, and I really go through the exercise of understanding what my own perspective is. Because right now, it's just this emotional weight on my heart, and I've got all this mental clutter because of it. And then I can react in strange ways. I could be sad, I could be angry, I could be resentful, as opposed to, okay, let's understand where those emotions emanate from. We're going to get back to the live stream. We got a bunch more questions coming up here. But Malabama, what do you got for us first?
Here's a minimalist insight from one of our listeners.
A quick note on this insight. This is from Connor Habib. I just did his podcast. It was one of the best conversations I've had. And he had a beautiful insight. We'll even talk about this in depth on the private podcast. Here is Connor Habib.
Hi, guys. This is Connor Habib, and I just want to say a few things about the open relationship monogamy thing. I think first, I just want to talk about intention and awareness. When we have an open relationship because we're afraid to commit, or when we have a monogamous relationship because we're insecure about losing our partner to someone else, then we're not making a decision about either relationship style. We're just sort of compulsively acting. I'm not making a judgment on that. I'm just saying that seems to happen a lot. The awareness and the intention is something that I'd really like to pay attention to in figuring out what's good or what's bad. I want to just be clear here and say, I'm not saying that awareness excuses everything or automatically means that you're doing something good. People say they're aware of things all the time to dismiss bad or compulsive behaviors, or behaviors that we don't even have to call them bad. We can just say that aren't really in that person's integrity. However, you can't really have intention and freedom without a sense of awareness. So awareness is a really high principle because it leads to freedom, which is one of the highest principles, and therefore it can lead to a real intentional kind of love. I think one of the main reasons to level a critique at monogamy more than open relationships is that, especially for heterosexual couples, monogamy is the default. And monogamy is the default in most cultural conversations, in most forms of art, love songs, movies, novels, whatever. So monogamy becomes the unthinking default. I think it might be sort of more instructive to think of monogamy as a certain type of perversion, the most widespread form of perversion. I don't mean that, by the way, in necessarily a negative way. I just think that if we view wedding rings, for instance, as this highly public S&M toy that people feel like they can wear into public without anyone commenting on it, you can kind of get a sense of what I mean. After all, you have this band around your finger that's saying, my partner controls who I am allowed to look at or talk to, how I'm allowed to touch another person or even fantasize about another person, much less actually have sex with others. In fact, this ring here is symbolizing complete sexual restraint and control and a certain set of real boundaries. And it also signals to everybody else who I'm having sex with publicly. So I think that we can view monogamy that way. And the problem isn't that it's a perversion. That's fine. It's just that it's somehow recognized as being outside of the field of being highly sexualized, outside of the field of being just another kind of kink. And when we start viewing it that way, we can sort of level the playing field. Because what we usually try to do is say, oh, well, an open relationship can be just as loving and fulfilling as monogamy. That is true. But we should also flip the script there and say, monogamy can also be perverse, and it can also be a hyper arousal mechanism and all that kind of stuff, because we really need to actually smooth out the playing field to allow people to say, I want to make an intentional choice about the kind of relationship I want to be in. I want to actually explore, discuss, think about, reflect, contemplate. I want to meditate even on these relationship choices with my partner and, make a real decision. Anyway, that's just a little bit there. Thanks for asking me to do this. Bye.
All right, y'all, that's our minimal episode for today. We'll see you on Patreon for the full 3-hour maximal edition of episode 385, which includes answers to a bunch more questions like, what do monogamy and open relationships have to do with minimalism? Isn't that just kind of relationship hoarding? We'll talk about relationship hoarding because I think that's a real thing. Is monogamy natural, or is it a result of cultural conditioning? How can I be in an open relationship without being judged by my friends, family, and community? Plus, a million more questions for Aubrey Marcus and the Minimalists. Also this week, we have a private minimalist home tour. One of our lovely listeners sent in this eclectic home tour. It's unlike any living room or dining room you have ever seen. We also have a minimalism story written 100% by ChatGPT. I think you'll be surprised by that one. And also, we have an added value segment for you, a song about monogamy, and much, much, much more about less. And if you want to hear all that, check out the Minimalist private podcast, patreon.com/theminimalist, or click the link in the description to subscribe and get your personal link so that our weekly maximal episodes play in your favorite podcast app. You'll also get access to all of our podcast archives, all the way back to episode 001. And if you're still on the fence, here's a testimonial from one of our lovely Patreon supporters. Justin says, thank you for everything you do with each private podcast episode. Every time I listen, it opens my mind to a different way of living. You even have my 16-year-old son hooked. I guess it's better to be hooked on minimalism than meth, right?
That's what the billboard says.
Big thanks to Aubrey Marcus for joining us today. You can check out his new course, by the way. It's called From Solo to Sacred Union. That's at aubreymarcus.com/relationships. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And you can check out his podcast, the Aubrey Marcus Podcast. And if you leave here today with just one message, please let it be this. Love people and use things, because the opposite never works. Thanks for listening, y'all.
We'll see you next time.
Peace.
Every little thing you think that you need, every little thing you think that you need, every little thing that's just feeding your greed. Oh, I bet that you'd be fine without it.